keeping up with the rankings here. Let's go outside of Florida for a second and just looking. I mean, Florida, you got 12 games in the season, and about half of Florida's schedule is ranked, and among those, Texas, Georgia, LSU, Tennessee, Miami, Ole Miss, Texas A&M. And in these 5 rankings, all were ranked and except 2 of them, the On3 rankings in 24/7. On3 didn't have Ole Miss ranked, and 24/7 didn't have Texas A&M ranked. They were all ranked in the other one. So, in looking at it, took the average ranking, Will, just from these 5 rankings from ESPN, Athlon, On3, 24/7 Sports, and CBS Sports. Florida's average ranking was 14 in those 5. Texas, number 1 out of those 5. Georgia, number 4. When you take a look at it, of course, Ohio State, Oregon, among Texas and Georgia, with those schools up there a lot. Penn State was another school fighting there in the top 5. That was the schools that saw the most there. LSU with an average rank of 11. Tennessee, 12. Miami, the same as Florida at 14. And for Ole Miss and Texas A&M, I just added 30 for them to kind of get an average there since they were right outside the top 25. Ole Miss 22, Texas 23. So, as I said, and kind of going where some of those prognostications went when they were ranking Florida and looking at this, Florida's going to have another. I mean, when does Florida not ever have a tough schedule? I guess you could ask ourselves that, but certainly coming off of this year, 2024, playing that same schedule again in 2025, just flipping home and away, Florida's going to have another landmine-filled schedule here, and it's kind of at the top. You go have 3 teams about fighting for the top 10 in Texas, Georgia, LSU to start the season, and then, of course, Tennessee not far out. Miami getting Carson Beck, I think, alleviates some of the quarterback questions people had for them. If they were rolling in here with Emory Williams, I'm not even sure they would be ranked, but Carson Beck raises the profile of their quarterback room, of course. Ole Miss replacing a lot with Jackson Dart and Princely Umon Yellen and so many transfers not on that team now. Texas A&M second year Mike Elko, of course. So really, Will, besides FSU, pretty much the same teams you see here that were going to be, ranked in the 2024 schedule and the 2025 schedule for the Gators. But of course, still having to face teams at the top.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what happens with Georgia. I think, Carson Beck was not very good last year. He was great 2 years ago. He was not good last year. And Georgia fundamentally was not a great team this year. They were 50th in yards per play allowed. They were 30th in yards per play, they were 30th in yards per play allowed, 50th in yards per play gained. So really, Florida.
And slow start after slow start after slow start for that team.
But even if you look at like the advanced stats, if you look at EPA differential, they're sort of middle of the pack. Like they weren't the worst team in the SEC by any stretch.
No.
But if you actually start ranking them,
still won the SEC championship.
Still won the SEC championship, which is a testament to Kirby. But in terms of EPA differential, they're like 6th or 7th overall, or were like 6th or 7th overall. Now they're adding another just group of 5 stars, and the question is, are they able to reload? But honestly, 2024 was not the season I expected to be a reload for Georgia. Like, they had a returning quarterback. They hadn't lost a ton in the draft on the defensive side. I mean, they'd lost some, but hadn't lost a ton in the draft. Like you said, inconsistent on offense ever since Monken left and went and turned Lamar into just an absolute star. I mean, he was winning MVPs anyway, but he's been even better the last couple of years. Ever since Monken left, the Georgia offense has been sort of stagnant. I'm really interested to see what happens this year and whether Georgia, the thing with Alabama that made them really impressive in the Saban era is that they were just able to continue it year after year after year after year after year. And you don't see that very often. I mean, maybe you could talk about the Bowden teams back with FSU. You could talk about the Nebraska teams under Tom Osborne. You could maybe talk about Oklahoma under Bob Stoops, certainly Florida under Spurrier. But really, traditionally, even teams that have been great, like you think about the Miami teams back in like 2000 and 2001, where Larry Coker took over and the whole thing fell apart, or even the Florida teams in the early 2000s where you've got Urban Meyer coming in. Typically, these sort of rises and falls have been a little bit more unexpected. And so I was really surprised to see Georgia take the step back they did. Now, again, won the SEC championship and made the playoff, but I think the underlying stats suggest there might be some issues there. So I'm really interested to see what happens with Georgia as we head in. Maybe Kirby fixes the problem, gets a quarterback in there, and is able to turn things around on the defensive side of the ball. But maybe they remain vulnerable.
Yeah, and you talked about Florida being on the road last year. Take a look at Georgia, and their loss at Alabama, at Ole Miss. It was. The SEC on the road is really tough, and I think we really saw it when LSU coming into the swamp, Ole Miss coming into the swamp. I mean, you really saw teams when the top of the pack came a little closer and had to go on the road. You really saw it play out where it became pretty tough in this conference to go win on the road.
Well, and this is where Lagway makes such a big difference. Being able to hit those big plays to give yourself a lead, to get a leg up on the guy that you're on the team that you're playing. Like, the fact that LSU's pretty much had to play from behind the entire game. The fact that Ole Miss, I think they jumped up 14-7, but then in the second half, we're pretty much playing catch up almost the entire game. Like, being able to put the onus on the offense and make them press a little bit, and all of a sudden you got Jackson Dart on the sideline crying because he's throwing interception after interception. Those are all like the Florida defense did a great job in those games, but the explosiveness of the Florida offense is one of the things that sort of enabled them to pin their ears back and really get after the quarterback and do a lot of the things that they were able to do. So it's a symbiotic relationship there. And I think the elevation in quarterback play, and quite honestly, the elevation in the belief in the quarterback and his ability to turn the game in any given second is something that's hard to measure, but certainly something that we saw. So, not only did teams like Georgia and LSU and Ole Miss kind of come back to the pack a little bit, maybe, but I think also Florida, the last half of the season, was able to raise certainly able to raise their ceiling, but I think even more significantly able to raise their floor, right? That even when Florida was struggling, there was always the possibility of a lightning strike. And, you'd see them go 3, 4, 5 drives where nothing happens, and all of a sudden, bam, as opposed to what had happened previously the last couple of years is, and even the Tennessee game this year is maybe a perfect microcosm of that. You spend a lot of time driving all the way down the field. You make one mistake, and all of a sudden, you wasted your 7-play, 75-yard drive because you're not able to convert a fourth down, or you fumble the ball on a QB sneak, or you miss a field goal or whatever. That's not really the way that DJ Lagway operates. Lagway ends up, it's like, you're not getting anything, not getting anything, not getting anything. 7.
Yeah. if it's a touchdown drive and it's more than 5 plays, I'm like, what, huh? What's happening here?
Well, and again, I think that's sort of the next step for him, right?
Yeah.
The next step is what happens when the defense plays drop 8, what happens when they force Florida to do some things, but also he should be much more equipped to do it, not just because he's had an off season to look at the film and understand what the coach wants him to do and be able to exploit those coverages, but also because he's going to have the ability to run, which is not something that he had at all in the second half of the year. So I think there's like all these caveats associated with Florida. Lagway obviously has to take a step forward, but there's so many things to like about the way he played, in particular when you factor in that he was injured along the way, and then it was kind of a freak injury. It wasn't something where like his hamstring gave because he was just putting too much pressure on. His hamstring gave because the turf at Jacksonville's field just is terrible. So I don't think any of these rankings are out of line. I think we can all see a scenario where Florida finishes in the top 10 and ends up in the playoff. I think we can all see a scenario where Florida ends up in this 14-18 range and just misses the playoff, kind of like Ole Miss and South Carolina this year. I think there's a scenario where Florida has some bad luck early on, or maybe some bad play early on, especially on the road, get a couple of key injuries, and now you're talking about just trying to hold on to get over that over-under. I'm not sure there's any scenario where I see Florida getting in the top 5. And I think that's maybe there is a ceiling here for Florida in 2025. Maybe things fall right in the playoff and they end up getting to play SMU and Boise State and Penn State on the way to a championship game. But again, given what we've had so far, if my biggest problem is trying to figure out where does Florida sit in the bracket, and can they get a good line in the bracket to the championship? If that's my biggest problem, we're having a damn good season, buddy. So
For sure. I think Tennessee's that enigma team for me. I was higher on them coming into this past season. A lot of that was due to I thought Nico would be a lot better than he would be. He did not. Their defense really kind of carried him. Dylan Sampson at running back really carried him. Can Nico take that next step for Tennessee? A lot of love for Tennessee here in these rankings, hovering around that top 10. Can they repeat and make the college football playoff again? So, before we kind of move on here, we are going to learn a lot about Florida's opponents the first week of the season. Taking a look at the 2025 season openers. Texas at defending national champion. Well, not defending because you don't defend your title in college football. That's just a habit there. At the current national champions, Texas had Ohio State to kick off the season. Notre Dame at Miami. LSU at Clemson. Alabama at FSU. Syracuse versus Tennessee. A lot of these teams ranked right here that we were discussing, we're going to learn a lot about in week one. Now, you're not going to learn everything, of course. Florida got better after getting shellacked by Miami, so it doesn't make you. But for a team like LSU to start with Clemson and then have Florida a couple of weeks later, Miami having to play Notre Dame and having to play Florida a couple of weeks later. I mean, we're going to learn about Miami and LSU pretty quick when Florida's playing Long Island, Florida's playing USF. And these season openers here, I mean, looking at Florida's opponents, it's going to be interesting to see, that's going to be, if Florida's is good and lives up to this ranking here, that's going to be a tough start for LSU, a tough start for Miami.
Yeah, well, that cuts both ways, right? I mean, obviously, if Miami comes out of its opening game with a win, and if LSU comes out of its opening game with a win, not only do they have the momentum, but also they're probably really, really good teams that Florida's going to have to be up for and take down. I think if they lose that game, even if I'm a Miami or LSU fan, I can make the case that I'd rather lose that early game and then be prepared for the rest of the schedule as well. I think in many ways.
Well, we've seen that with Florida, in Billy Napier's first 3 years. Miami.
Only takes 4 games to get ready.
No, I'm just saying Utah, Miami. He's had that first game. This is the first year he's had a breather to start week one, and these teams are going out there and fighting for their lives week one.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think it can be a good thing or a bad thing. Obviously, 2017 against Michigan, sort of dive bomb Florida season there with Jim McElwain. It is entirely possible. And look, I mean, Florida State with Georgia Tech this year, right? They lose that one on a last-second field goal and never really recover from that along the way. So,
and sometimes the opener can be a good indication.
And you think about it, I mean, you've got the LSU USC game that I thought was like a battle of two titans, and it turns out it was sort of a battle of two middling teams in each conference. Yeah. So that's the other part of it is every year in college football we get a little bit surprised. Nobody would have picked Indiana to be in the top 10. I think maybe you would have picked Tennessee to be there. You certainly wouldn't have picked SMU to be there. Penn State has historically sort of been on the outside, and they were a little bit better this year. So, look, I think there's going to be some rise and fall and ebb and flow. I honestly, so I think given what we've seen with the history of Florida and Billy Napier, I'm glad that he's got a couple of cupcakes before they get into the meat of the schedule. At the same time, those cupcakes have kind of been a breather after a tough game, right? I mean, even the game against Utah in his opening season, they win that game and then come out and lay an egg against Kentucky. And I think that's one of the challenges that you run into in the SEC that you don't run into in some of these other conferences is those teams aren't as good as you in many cases when you play them. But if you've just come off of a game where you're getting beaten up, okay, well now it really does make a difference. And so, Florida had that weird stretch this past year where every time they played somebody, they were coming off a bye. And so those sorts of things do make a difference in the long term. It's one of the reasons why I think we all thought Florida was going to struggle on the back end of the schedule. I think 6.5 is aggressively low, right? I think given what Florida saw with DJ Lagway, if he can stay healthy all year, I think 6-5 is, and considering you got 4 of your 5 offensive linemen coming back, I think that's one of those things where you go, okay, if you're going to keep your quarterback healthy, this is the year you're going to keep him healthy. And so, and if you think about the defense, you've got Banks and Sapp, sort of your 2 best players there as well, coming back. So if you had to ask me today, I'd tell you I'm going to take the over. But really,
Same.
I think most Florida fans aren't going, ooh, 8-4.